Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you can make a really complicated decision super fast, and other times even a simple choice feels overwhelming, and you make a mistake? Well, this new study dives into exactly that. Imagine your brain is like a super smart computer constantly trying to figure out what is going on around you. When you see something, your brain doesn't just say, "That is a dog." It considers lots of possibilities, maybe dog, maybe fox, maybe something else. Some scientists think our brains do this by building a really detailed picture, like a complex map of all the possibilities. But then other people notice that we often make mistakes, especially when making quick decisions. This leads to a big question in psychology: are our brains actually bad at creating these complex pictures? Or is something else going on? This paper is all about that debate. The researchers here are asking if maybe our brains aren't inherently limited in their complexity, but instead save energy by using simpler mental shortcuts when the task allows them to. Think of it like this: if a job can be done with a basic tool, why bother bringing out the whole toolbox? So how do you even test something like this? The scientists designed 3 experiments building on a previous study that looked at how people identify the most common color in an array of circles. In that earlier study, people often seemed to make less than perfect choices. The researchers in this new paper thought that maybe those mistakes weren't actual limits of the brain, but smart ways participants found to solve the puzzle with less effort, especially when the task didn't force them to be super detailed. In their first experiment, they used a task where people had to pick the more dominant color from a display of colored circles. Sometimes all the possible colors were options, and sometimes the most dominant color was left out. This second case, which they called non-dominant 2 AFC trials, was the key. If you only focus on the most dominant color and suddenly it is not an option, you are stuck. But if you kept track of other colors too, you have a better chance of picking the right answer. They found that when these trickier non-dominant trials were included, the way people made decisions pointed towards them using simpler mental representations, like just focusing on 1 or 2 colors rather than a full complex picture of all the colors. Basically, when the task was easier and they could get away with it, people seemed to use simpler mental models. But when the task got a bit harder and they had to consider more options, the data started to suggest they were building more complex representations. It wasn't a super strong finding yet, but it opened the door for more investigation. So, they decided to ramp things up in experiment 2. They changed the number of circles of each color to make the differences between colors even more subtle. This was done to amplify the potential differences between the simple and complex mental models. If a simple model makes a mistake and a complex model gets it right, they could see a clearer pattern. The results here were more striking. For most of the trials, a representation that looked at the 2 highest most dominant colors seemed to explain the data best. This is still simpler than keeping track of every single possibility, but it is more complex than just the single most dominant color. They saw that when the task forced them to consider more options, people were less likely to rely on just the simplest strategy and more likely to use this intermediate too, Higgins strategy. This showed a clear progression. As the task demanded more, the mental representation tended to become more sophisticated. Then came experiment 3, the final test here. They really stacked the deck against simple strategies. They designed the trial specifically so that if you only focused on a few colors, you'd likely guess wrong to succeed. You basically had to consider a full picture of all the colors. And guess what? This time, the data strongly favored the most complex model, the one that represents the full distribution of possibilities. The results here were a runaway win for the complex model. It was overwhelmingly more likely to explain how people made their decisions than the simpler models. This was the moment the researchers felt they had strong evidence for their core idea. So, what does this all mean? The scientists here argue that when we see people making seemingly suboptimal decisions, meaning they're not performing perfectly, it is often not because their brains are limited. Instead, it is because our brains are incredibly efficient and resource-rational. They use the simplest strategy that works for the task at hand. If a quick decision can be made by just thinking about the top 2 colors, and that is usually good enough, why go through the effort of mapping out all 4 or 5 possibilities in detail? But when the task demands it, like in their experiment 3, when guessing wrong by being too simple has real consequences, our brains are capable of building and using those more complex detailed representations. They are not necessarily probabilistic in the strict mathematical sense of a probability curve, but they definitely hold more information than a simple summary. This is a really important point for anyone studying how we see and make decisions. It means researchers need to be super careful when designing experiments. If your task accidentally allows people to succeed with a shortcut, you might mistakenly conclude that their brains can't handle complexity, when in reality, they're just being smart and saving energy. The real takeaway, though, is that our perceptual representations, how we mentally model the world, aren't fixed. They can be simple or complex, tailored to the demands of the situation. It is a dynamic process driven by efficiency and the need to succeed. This study really highlights that the way we design our experiments is just as crucial as the way we analyze the data, especially when we're trying to understand the inner workings of the mind. This research is fascinating because it shifts the focus from inherent limitations to intelligent adaptation. It suggests our brains are less like faulty machines and more like savvy decision makers, always looking for the most efficient path to understanding the world. It makes me wonder about everyday situations when you're trying to read a messy sign in the distance. Do you first try to guess the most common letters, or do you really try to parse out every little detail? This experiment suggests it is probably the former, until the sign is so blurry that you have to engage those deeper processing strategies. The study does have limitations, of course. The task was quite artificial, involving arrays of colored circles. Real-world perception is way more complex and dynamic. We don't always know the exact options available, and our goals are often much broader than just picking the most dominant color. Future research could explore these ideas in more naturalistic settings, perhaps with tasks that involve recognizing objects, understanding scenes, or making more nuanced social judgments. Can we see similar shifts in representational complexity there? Overall, this is a compelling piece of research that challenges our assumptions about cognitive limits and celebrates the remarkable efficiency of the human mind. It reminds us that suboptimal behavior might just be a sign of intelligent adaptation to the constraints we face. What do you think about these findings? Do you recognize this efficient approach in your own decision-making? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into perception, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science breakdowns, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.